The night my husband almost erased me from his life started with a candlelit dinner. He insisted on planning himself, just 48 hours after we got back from our honeymoon, and I remember thinking how strange it was that he kept checking the door like he was waiting for someone else to arrive. I remember the way his hand tightened around his glass when his phone buzzed, and how he smiled at me a second too late, like he had to remind himself to look like a loving husband. And I remember the exact moment everything inside me shifted, when a stranger's shadow fell across our table, and I realized without understanding why, that I was the only one in that room who didn't know what was about to happen. I didn't know yet that I had just been set up, that my own husband had already made a decision about my future without me, and that the life I thought I had married into was already slipping through my fingers like something that had never been real to begin with. And if you've ever had that moment where your gut tells you something is wrong before your mind can catch up, then you already know how this feels. And only if this story truly resonates with you, I'd love for you to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is for you right now, because knowing where you are somehow makes this feel less lonely. My name is Ava Collins. I'm 29 years old, and this is the night I realized my marriage wasn't a beginning. It was a setup, and everything that followed would change my life forever. It all started just 2 nights earlier, on a quiet Sunday evening, when Mason drove us down to a place he said he'd been saving for a perfect moment, a restaurant perched on the edge of the Pacific, all glass walls and soft amber lighting, the kind of place where the ocean looks close enough to touch and every table feels like it belongs to someone celebrating something important. I remember the valet taking the keys to our car, a black SUV. Mason had insisted on renting just for the weekend, even though we had our own perfectly good car back home, and I remember laughing about it, teasing him for being dramatic, for wanting everything to feel cinematic, and he just smiled and said, "You deserve something special." And I believed him, because that's what you do when you're still living inside the version of someone you fell in love with. Inside, the air smelled like citrus and butter, soft music playing just loud enough to fill the spaces between conversations, and our table was set near the window, the ocean stretching out behind Mason like something unreal, waves catching the last light of sunset. And for a moment, everything felt exactly the way I thought a marriage should feel: calm, steady, safe. Mason reached across the table, brushed his thumb over my knuckles, and said, "To us," and I lifted my glass, smiling back, trying to ignore the tiny flicker of unease I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anything obvious, not yet. Just small things that didn't line up perfectly: the way he kept glancing toward the entrance, the way his phone was face down but never more than an inch from his hand, the way his smile lingered just a second too long like he was holding it in place. "Everything okay?" I asked at one point, and he nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just work stuff. Nothing I can't handle." And I told myself that was normal, that people had responsibilities, that not everything had to mean something more. Our drinks arrived, and I noticed he didn't touch his right away. Just let it sit there while he checked his phone again, his jaw tightening for half a second before he locked the screen and slid it back onto the table. I tried to follow his gaze, but there was nothing there, just other couples, quiet conversations, a server moving between tables. "You're being weird," I said, smiling to soften it, and he laughed. That same familiar sound I'd heard 100 times before, but something about it felt thinner, like it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just want tonight to be perfect," he said, and I remember thinking how strange that sounded, like perfection was something he needed to manage, instead of something we were already inside. Our food came, plates set down with practiced precision, and for a few minutes, everything slipped back into place. Easy conversation, shared glances, the kind of quiet comfort that makes you believe you chose the right person. But then his phone buzzed again, and this time he didn't ignore it. He glanced at the screen, and something changed in his face, subtle, but enough that I felt it in my chest before I could name it. "I need to take this," he said, already pushing his chair back. "It's important," and I nodded, watching him stand, watching the way he turned slightly away from me as he answered, lowering his voice as he walked toward the far end of the dining room. I told myself not to read into it, not to let my mind run ahead of me, but I couldn't stop watching him, the way he paced slowly, one hand pressed to his ear, the other running through his hair, like he was trying to solve something that couldn't wait. I picked up my glass, took a sip, and that's when I felt it, that shift, like the air had changed around me, like something unseen had stepped into the space Mason had just left behind. I didn't turn right away, but I knew someone was there, standing just out of my line of sight, and when I finally looked up, I saw him, an older man, maybe in his 70s, dressed in a simple gray jacket, his eyes locked on mine with a kind of urgency that made my breath catch. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself, didn't hesitate. He moved closer, just enough to reach the edge of the table, and before I could say a word, his hand slid under the folded napkin in front of me, pressing something firm and warm against my palm. His fingers closing over mine for just a second as he leaned in, his voice barely more than a whisper, "Run now, don't let him take you home." For a second I did not move, because my brain refused to process what had just happened. The warmth of the cash still pressed into my palm beneath the folded napkin, his words echoing in my head in a way that did not sound like panic, but certainty, like he knew something I did not, like he had already seen how this night ended. I kept my hands still, forcing myself to breathe, forcing my face to stay neutral as I glanced up, but the man was already walking away, blending into the soft glow of the dining room as if he had never been there at all. I told myself to stand up, to follow him, to ask what he meant, but then I heard Mason's voice behind me, and everything inside me locked into place. "Sorry about that," he said, sliding back into his chair with that same easy smile, the same calm tone, like nothing had changed, like I was the only one carrying something invisible between us. I nodded, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the napkin, hiding the cash underneath it. "Work?" I asked, and he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, just a client being difficult. Nothing I cannot handle." And I watched his eyes as he said it, searching for something I could not quite name, some crack in the version of him I thought I knew. "You okay?" he added, tilting his head slightly, and I realized I had been staring at him too long. "Yeah, just tired," I said, forcing a small smile, but my voice felt different to my own ears, like it belonged to someone else. He studied me for a second, then reached for his glass, finally taking a sip, and I noticed his hand was steadier now, like whatever that call had been about had settled something for him. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, and carefully slid my hand under the napkin, feeling the edges of the bills, thick, folded, real. I did not count them, I did not need to, just knowing they were there made everything feel heavier, more real, more urgent. "I'm going to step to the restroom," I said, keeping my tone light, casual, the way I always did, and he nodded immediately, too quickly. "Want me to come with you?" he asked, and that was when something cold moved through my chest, because that was not a normal question. Not here, not now. "No, I will be right back," I said, standing before he could say anything else, grabbing my purse with my free hand, keeping the napkin folded over the cash as I moved. I could feel his eyes on me as I walked away, steady, focused, not relaxed the way they had been earlier, and I resisted the urge to turn around, to check, to confirm what I already felt. The hallway to the restrooms was dimmer, quieter, the sounds of the dining room fading behind me, replaced by the low hum of ventilation and the soft echo of my own footsteps. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, locking myself in a stall even though I did not need to, my hands finally shaking as I unfolded the napkin. There were $600 bills, crisp, folded tight, no note, no explanation, just the weight of them sitting in my palm like a decision I had not made yet. "Run now," he had said, "not later, not think about it, not ask questions. Run." I stared at my reflection in the small mirror above the sink when I stepped out, my face pale, my eyes wider than I expected, and for a second I almost laughed, because nothing looked different, nothing looked like danger, and yet everything felt wrong. I tried to reason through it, to make it make sense. Maybe the man was confused. Maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. Maybe it was a cruel joke, something random and meaningless that I was turning into something bigger because I was tired, because weddings and travel and all the changes had left me more sensitive than usual. I took a deep breath, pressing my hands flat against the counter, and that was when I saw it, something I had not noticed before, sitting on the edge of the sink, a faint smear of red on the rim of my wine glass that I knew had not been there when I first lifted it. I froze, my mind replaying the moment I had taken that sip, the slight bitterness I had ignored, the way Mason had not touched his own drink until after his call, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air tighter, like I had stepped into something I could not see but could not escape either. I grabbed a paper towel, wiping my hands even though they were already clean, my thoughts moving faster now, connecting things I had not wanted to connect. The rental SUV, the way he had insisted on valet, the way he had paid the bill early, the way he had asked to come with me just now. Not out of concern, but control. I reached into my purse, pulling out my phone, my fingers hovering over his contact, over the option to call him, to confront him, to demand an explanation that would probably come wrapped in something calm and convincing, something that would make me doubt myself again. But then I heard the man's voice in my head, quiet and certain, and I knew one thing, with a clarity I had not felt all night. If I went back to that table, I would be stepping back into whatever this was, whatever had already been set in motion without me. I slipped the cash into my purse, zipped it closed, and took one last look at myself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman staring back, the one who had walked in here believing she was safe. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding now, not from panic, but from decision, and instead of heading back to the dining room, I pushed the door open and stepped into the side hallway that led away from the tables, away from Mason, away from the version of my life that had just started to unravel. I pushed through the side hallway expecting it to lead somewhere quiet, maybe an exit sign, maybe a staff door, but instead I found myself in a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and something metallic I could not place. The kind of place customers were not meant to wander into, and for a second I hesitated, my hand still on the door behind me, thinking maybe I should go back, maybe I was overreacting, maybe I was about to destroy something good because of one strange moment with a stranger I did not even know. But then my phone buzzed in my hand, sharp and sudden, and I looked down to see Mason's name lighting up the screen. And something about the timing, about how quickly he was calling, made my chest tighten. I did not answer. I just stared at it as it rang, my thumb hovering, and when it stopped, another message appeared almost instantly. "Where are you?" Followed by another before I could even process the first. "Ava, are you okay?" And then a third, more direct. "Come back." The tone shifting so fast it felt less like concern and more like control. I swallowed, slipping the phone into my purse, and kept walking. My steps quieter now, slower, like I was afraid of being heard even though there was no one in sight. The corridor stretched ahead of me, dim overhead lights casting long shadows, and I noticed a door slightly ajar at the end, a thin line of night air slipping through, carrying the sound of waves and distant traffic, and relief hit me so suddenly it almost made me dizzy, because that meant outside, that meant distance, that meant space between me and whatever was happening back at that table. I reached the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cool evening air behind the restaurant, where the noise of the ocean was louder, raw and constant, the kind of sound that made everything else feel smaller for a moment. There was a service lot back there, a few parked cars, a dumpster near the wall, and a single dim security light flickering above a side entrance. And I stood there for a second, breathing, trying to steady myself, trying to think clearly instead of react. I told myself I needed to slow down, that running without a plan was not the same as escaping, that I needed to understand what I was running from before I decided where to go. But then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was not a call. It was a message, short, simple, and it made my stomach drop. "Did you leave the table?" And I froze. Because that was not a question someone asks unless they already know the answer should be no. I turned slowly, instinctively looking back toward the building, toward the glowing windows of the dining room, and from this angle I could see silhouettes moving inside, servers passing between tables, the soft rhythm of a normal night continuing like nothing was wrong, like nothing had shifted, like I was the only one standing outside of it. And then I saw him, not clearly, not enough to make out every detail, but enough to recognize the way he stood, the way his shoulders squared when he was searching for something, for someone, and I felt that cold certainty again, deeper this time, sharper, like a line had been drawn, and I had just stepped across it. I moved back instinctively, stepping behind one of the parked cars, my heart pounding harder now, not just from fear, but from the realization that whatever this was, it was already unfolding whether I understood it or not. Another message came through, slower this time, almost careful. "Ava, answer me." And I could picture his face as he typed it, controlled, measured, the same way he had been at dinner, and suddenly that version of him felt less like my husband and more like someone I had only just started to see clearly. I tightened my grip on my purse, feeling the edges of the cash inside, grounding myself in something real, something that had been handed to me as a warning, not a suggestion, and I forced myself to think, to connect the pieces instead of letting them spin around me. The wine, the call, the messages, the question about the restroom, the insistence on the valet, the way everything had been arranged just so, it all pointed to something planned, something timed, something that depended on me being exactly where I was supposed to be at exactly the right moment, and I was not there anymore. A sudden noise from the far end of the lot made me turn, a car engine starting, headlights cutting through the dim space as a vehicle pulled out from behind the building, moving slower than normal, like the driver was looking for something, and I felt my pulse spike again, because I did not know if it was connected or if my mind was filling in patterns that were not there, but I did not want to find out by standing still. I stepped away from the car I had been hiding behind, moving quickly now toward the edge of the lot, where a narrow path led down toward the street below, gravel crunching softly under my shoes, every sound suddenly too loud, too exposed, and I resisted the urge to run outright, forcing myself to stay controlled, to stay aware. Halfway down the path, my phone buzzed again, and this time the message was different, shorter, colder. "If you left, do not go back to the car." And I stopped dead, the words sinking in slowly, because I had not told him I left. I had not said anything at all, and yet he knew enough to warn me about the one place I might have gone without thinking. I turned the phone over in my hand, staring at the screen, at his name, at the message, and for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me that was not just fear or confusion, but clarity, sharp and undeniable, because whatever was happening tonight, whatever had been planned around me without my knowledge, I was no longer inside it the way I was supposed to be, and that meant one thing. I was not safe if I followed the path he expected, and I had no idea how far that plan reached or what else had already been set in motion beyond what I could see. I stood there on that narrow path with the ocean wind cutting through my dress, my phone still in my hand, staring at that message over and over again like it might change if I blinked hard enough. "If you left, do not go back to the car." And the longer I looked at it, the clearer it became that this was not concern. It was instruction. The kind of instruction someone gives when they are managing a situation, not reacting to it. My chest tightened as I turned slowly, looking back up toward the restaurant, toward the service lot where the SUV headlights had just moved, and suddenly every decision I had almost made felt like a step I had narrowly avoided, like I had been walking down a path that had already been mapped out for me without my knowledge. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to separate what I knew from what I was afraid of, because panic would not help me now, and that was when another realization settled in, quiet but heavy. Mason had expected me to go back to the car. He had expected me to follow the normal pattern, finish dinner, walk out together, get into that SUV, and go wherever he had planned next. But I had broken that pattern, and now he was adjusting. I slipped my phone back into my purse, my fingers brushing against the cash again, grounding myself in that single, undeniable fact. Someone else had known this was coming. Someone else had risked enough to warn me, and that meant whatever this was, it was not random, it was not a misunderstanding, it was something real, something that had already happened before, or had been building long before tonight. The sound of tires on gravel snapped my attention back up the slope, and I saw the SUV again, this time closer to the edge of the lot, moving slower now, almost crawling, like the driver was scanning the area, and I felt my heartbeat spike again because I did not need confirmation to know that I could not let that car find me. I turned and moved further down the path, my steps faster now, less controlled, the gravel giving way to packed dirt and then to uneven pavement as the path curved toward the street below. The lights from the restaurant faded behind me, replaced by the dim glow of a street lamp and the distant hum of passing cars. And for a moment I felt exposed in a different way, out in the open, visible, with nowhere to hide. I reached the bottom of the path and stepped onto the sidewalk, The ocean now to my left, dark and endless, the road stretching out ahead of me with only a few scattered vehicles passing by, and I realized I did not have a plan. Not yet, just distance, just instinct, just the need to not be where I was supposed to be. My phone buzzed again, and this time I hesitated before taking it out. My hands colder now, my thoughts sharper. And when I looked at the screen, I saw another message, longer this time. Ava, this is not funny. You need to answer me right now. And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how familiar that tone was, how easily it could have been read as frustration, as worry, as a husband trying to reach his wife. And yet now it felt different, layered, like every word carried something underneath it I had never noticed before. I typed nothing, I said nothing, and instead I looked up and down the road, searching for something, anything that would give me an option, a direction that was mine and not his. A car passed, headlights sweeping over me for a brief second, and I stepped back instinctively, pulling my purse closer to my body, suddenly aware of how alone I was, how far I was from anything familiar, how quickly my life had shifted from something predictable to something I could not map out anymore. I started walking, not toward the parking lot, not back toward the restaurant, but in the opposite direction, following the curve of the road away from the lights, away from the place where everything had started to unravel. Each step felt both too slow and too fast, like I was either about to be caught or already too late to avoid something I could not see. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not need to look to know it was him. The pattern was too consistent, too controlled, like he was trying to maintain a connection he could not physically enforce anymore. I kept walking, my breath uneven now, my mind racing through possibilities I did not want to fully form, because each one led somewhere darker than the last. And then, just as I reached a small intersection where the road split into two directions, I saw something that made me stop completely. A second vehicle parked across the street, engine running, headlights off, positioned in a way that did not make sense for someone just waiting, and I felt that same cold clarity settle over me again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about one moment, or one message, or one strange interaction. This was coordinated, this was structured, this was something that had been put into place with intention. I stepped back slowly, my eyes scanning the area, my senses sharper than they had ever been, and for the first time since this began, I understood something with absolute certainty. I was not just leaving a dinner, I was stepping out of a plan, and whoever had built that plan had not expected me to do that, which meant I was now the variable they had not accounted for, and that realization, as terrifying as it was, also meant I still had one thing they did not control: what I did next. I did not move toward that intersection right away, because something about that parked car felt wrong in a way I could not explain. The engine running, but the headlights off, positioned just far enough from the street lamp to stay in shadow. And I stood there for a second too long, trying to decide if I was imagining it, or if this was another piece of something I was only just beginning to understand. My instincts told me to keep walking, to act normal, to not draw attention to myself, but nothing about this felt normal anymore. And the more I tried to force it into something familiar, the more it slipped out of reach. I took a slow step backward instead of forward, my shoes scraping lightly against the pavement, my eyes still locked on that car, waiting for some sign that it was just someone parked, just someone checking their phone, just anything ordinary that would let me breathe again. But the car did not move, did not shift, did not give me anything to hold on to, and that silence, that stillness, felt louder than any noise could have been. My phone buzzed again, sharp and insistent, and this time I pulled it out immediately, almost needing to see it, needing to anchor myself to something I could read, something I could interpret. "Ava, answer me. You are scaring me now," the message read, and for a split second, that old instinct kicked in, the one that wanted to reassure him, to explain, to smooth things over the way I always had when something felt off between us. But that instinct did not belong to the version of me standing here now, and I felt it clearly, like a shift in my own thinking, like I was finally seeing the difference between what I had believed and what was actually happening. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my purse without replying, my fingers brushing the edge of the cash again, and this time it did not feel strange or out of place. It felt like a tool, like something given to me for a reason I was only just beginning to understand. I turned away from the intersection, choosing the narrower road that curved down toward the shoreline, away from the parked car, away from the direction Mason would expect me to take if I had simply stepped outside for air. Each step felt deliberate now, not rushed, not panicked, but intentional, like I was rewriting something that had already been set in motion. The wind picked up as I moved further from the restaurant, carrying the scent of salt and damp wood, the sound of the ocean growing louder, more present, and for a moment I focused on that, on something constant, something that did not change based on someone else's plan. I reached a small stretch of sidewalk that ran parallel to the beach access, a row of low wooden fences separating the road from the sand below, and I paused again, scanning the area, checking behind me, listening for anything out of place. Nothing followed, nothing rushed toward me, and that silence felt both like relief and a warning, like the kind of quiet that comes before something shifts again. I pulled my phone out one more time, not to answer him, but to check something else, the time, the signal, the small details that might tell me how far I could get before he changed tactics, before whatever he had planned adjusted to the fact that I was no longer where I was supposed to be. The screen lit up with another message before I could even unlock it, shorter this time, almost clipped. "Ava, we need to talk," and I stared at it for a second because that sentence, simple as it was, carried a different weight now. Not a request, not an invitation, but something closer to a correction, like I had stepped out of line and he was trying to pull me back into place. I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked up just in time to see headlights crest the curve behind me, moving faster than the other cars had been. Not speeding, but purposeful, steady, like the driver knew exactly where they were going. I stepped off the sidewalk instinctively, moving closer to the wooden fence, my body turning slightly away from the road, my face angled down as if I were just another person out for air, not someone trying to stay unseen. The car passed, the headlights sweeping over me for a brief second, and in that flash of light, I saw the silhouette of the driver, a shape I could not fully make out, but something about the way they sat, the way they did not glance toward me, felt intentional, like they were not looking because they already knew what they were supposed to see. The car continued down the road, disappearing around the next bend, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders dropping slightly as the tension shifted, but did not disappear. I leaned against the fence for a second, my fingers curling around the rough wood, grounding myself again, forcing my thoughts into something structured instead of scattered. This was not random, I repeated to myself. This was not coincidence. This was not just a bad feeling. And the more I accepted that, the clearer everything became. Not safer, but clearer. I thought about the sequence again, the dinner, the call, the warning, the messages, the cars, the positioning of everything, and it all pointed to one thing. Timing? Everything depended on timing, on me being in a specific place at a specific moment. And now that I was not, the pattern was breaking in ways I could see in real time. I pushed myself off the fence and kept moving, this time toward a small cluster of lights further down the road, a late-night convenience store I could just make out in the distance, its bright interior cutting through the dark like a marker, like something fixed, something predictable, something that existed outside whatever this was. As I walked, my pace steadied, my breathing evened out, and for the first time since I left the table, I felt something shift inside me that was not fear or confusion, but something sharper, more focused, because I was no longer just reacting. I was choosing where to go, choosing what not to do, choosing to stay outside the version of events that had already been decided for me. And as I reached the edge of that light, the glow of the store spilling out onto the pavement, I realized something else, something that settled deep in my chest with a quiet certainty. Whatever Mason had planned for tonight, it depended on me trusting him, on me following him, and on me not questioning anything. And the moment I stopped doing that, the moment I stepped away from that script, everything began to change in ways he could not fully control. I stepped into the convenience store without looking back, the sharp buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead hitting me almost as hard as the cold air conditioning. And for a second, the normalcy of it all felt surreal, like I had crossed into a completely different world, where nothing strange was happening, and no one was watching me. A man in his 50s stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, barely glancing up as the bell above the door chimed, and I moved further inside, past rows of snacks and refrigerators humming quietly, forcing myself to slow down, to look like someone who belonged there, not someone trying to disappear. I grabbed a bottle of water I did not need, holding it in my hand like a prop, something to justify my presence. And then I walked toward the back of the store where a small security mirror hung in the corner, angled just enough to show the front door and part of the street outside. I stopped there, pretending to read the label on the bottle while my eyes flicked upward, watching the reflection carefully, waiting to see if anyone followed me in, waiting for something to confirm or deny what I was beginning to believe. Seconds passed, then a full minute, then another, and nothing happened. No one rushed in. No one scanned the room. No one looked like they were searching for me, and yet the tension did not leave my body. It just shifted, settling deeper, more controlled, like I was learning how to carry it instead of fight it. My phone buzzed again in my purse, and this time I did not even need to look to know it was him. The pattern had become predictable, the rhythm of his messages almost mechanical, and I let it ring out before finally pulling it out, more curious now than afraid. "Ava, this is getting ridiculous. Pick up your phone," the message read, and I could almost hear the edge in his voice behind those words. Not panic, not fear, but irritation, like something was not going according to plan, and he was starting to feel it. I locked the screen again without replying, slipping the phone back into my bag, and for the first time since this started, I felt a flicker of something that was not just fear, it was awareness. The kind that comes when you stop seeing someone as who you thought they were and start seeing the pattern of what they actually do. I walked up to the counter, set the bottle down, and paid in cash, my voice steady when I said thank you, my movements calm, practiced, like I had done this 100 times before, even though every part of me felt different now. "You all right?" The cashier asked casually as he handed me my change, and I nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, just a long day," I said, and the simplicity of that lie almost made me smile, because it was the closest thing to normal I had said all night. I stepped back from the counter and moved toward the small seating area near the front window, 2 plastic chairs and a narrow counter facing the glass, and I sat down, placing the bottle in front of me, giving myself a clear view of the street outside, while still being inside a space that felt contained, controlled. Cars passed occasionally, headlights cutting across the dark, but none slowed, none turned in, and the parked car from earlier was nowhere in sight, which should have reassured me but did not. Because absence did not mean safety. It just meant movement, adjustment, something happening out of my view. I unscrewed the cap of the water bottle and took a small sip, more for something to do than because I was thirsty. And as I set it back down, my thoughts began to organize themselves in a way they had not before, less scattered, more deliberate. I thought about the timeline again, not as a series of confusing moments, but as steps, intentional, connected, the dinner, the call, the drink, the valet, the messages, the positioning of the cars, and the more I laid it out in my mind, the clearer the pattern became. This had not been spontaneous. It had been arranged, structured, something that relied on me moving exactly where I was expected to move, and I had not done that. My phone buzzed again, and this time I picked it up immediately, not to respond but to read, because understanding his behavior was starting to matter more than reacting to it. "Ava, I am outside, come back now," and my breath caught for a second, my eyes lifting instinctively toward the window, scanning the parking lot, the street, every angle I could see from where I sat. There was no SUV, no sign of him, nothing that matched what he had written, and that was when something shifted again, sharper this time, because if he was not where he said he was, then the message was not about location. It was about control, about directing me, about pulling me back into a space where he could manage what happened next. I set the phone down slowly, my fingers tapping lightly against the plastic counter, and for the first time, I let the thought fully form in my mind without pushing it away. What if the man was right? Not just about leaving, but about everything. What if the version of my husband I had trusted was never the full picture? What if tonight was not the beginning of something going wrong, but the moment I finally saw what had already been in motion? I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes still on the street, my mind moving through possibilities that felt less like speculation and more like reconstruction, and as unsettling as it was, it also brought something else with it, a strange, steady clarity, because if this had been planned, if this had been built step by step, then it could also be undone, piece by piece, if I stayed outside of it long enough to understand it. I reached into my purse again, my fingers brushing the folded cash, and this time I pulled it out, smoothing the bills against the counter, looking at them not as something random, but as evidence, as a signal, as proof that someone had seen what I was only now beginning to see. And as I sat there under the harsh fluorescent lights, watching the reflection of the street in the glass, I realized something that settled deep and quiet inside me. This night was not over, not even close, and whatever Mason had planned, whatever he had set into motion, I was no longer moving through it blindly, which meant for the first time since I walked into that restaurant, I had something he did not expect, time to think, and the awareness to use it. I sat there watching my reflection faintly overlay the dark street outside the glass, my fingers still resting on the folded bills on the counter. And for the first time since I walked out of that restaurant, I stopped thinking about what Mason was doing and started thinking about who else knew. Because the man who warned me had not hesitated, he had not questioned himself, he had not acted like someone making a guess, he had acted like someone interrupting something he had already seen before, and that thought stayed with me, quiet but persistent, threading through everything else I was trying to process. My phone buzzed again, and this time the message was shorter than all the others, almost stripped down. "Ava, answer me now." And I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. There was no more softness in the wording, no attempt to sound concerned, no effort to keep up the version of him I was used to, just a direct command, and it confirmed something I had been feeling without fully naming. The longer I stayed out of reach, the less he needed to pretend. I picked up the phone and stared at his name for a few seconds, not to respond, but to study it, to separate the man I had married from the pattern I was seeing now. And the distance between those two things felt wider with every passing moment. I set the phone down again and leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on the counter, forcing myself to think through this in a way that was deliberate instead of reactive, because whatever came next was not going to be about instinct alone, it was going to require understanding. I replayed the night from the beginning again, slower this time, more carefully, not just what happened, but how it happened, the order, the timing, the way each moment led into the next like steps in something structured, the call that pulled him away at exactly the moment the stranger approached me, the untouched drink in front of him compared to the one I had already taken a sip from, the prearranged valet, the positioning of the cars, the messages that shifted from concern to control, and the more I laid it out in my mind, the clearer it became. This was not about one mistake or one bad decision. This was a system, something practiced, something repeated. My stomach tightened as that realization settled in, because systems like that do not appear overnight. They are built, refined, tested, and that meant I was not the first person this had been done to, or at the very least, not the first time it had been attempted. I reached for the cash again, flipping through the bills more carefully this time, looking for anything I might have missed, a note, a mark, something that would tell me more about the man who had given it to me. But there was nothing. Just clean bills, deliberate and simple, like the message itself, run. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a second, letting everything settle, letting the noise in my head quiet just enough for one clear question to come through, why me? And as soon as I asked it, an answer began to form, not complete, not fully shaped, but enough to make my chest tighten again, because this was not just about timing or location. It was about me, my life, my assets, my connections, the things Mason knew about me long before we ever sat at that table tonight. I opened my eyes again and reached into my purse, pulling out my phone one more time, but this time I did not look at his messages first. I opened my banking app, my email, the accounts I had trusted him to help manage over the past year, the things I had shared with him without thinking twice, and as the screens loaded, as the familiar interfaces appeared, I felt a quiet shift in my awareness, like I was no longer just a person reacting to a situation, but someone starting to examine it from the outside. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating for just a second before I tapped into the most recent transactions, and as the list appeared, nothing immediately jumped out as wrong, nothing obvious, nothing that screamed danger. But that did not reassure me the way it would have before, because now I understood something I had not understood earlier. Whatever this was, it was not going to be obvious, it was going to be hidden in plain sight. structured to look normal until the exact moment it was not. My phone buzzed again in my hand, interrupting my thoughts, and this time I did not need to read the message to know it was him. The persistence alone told me that, but I looked anyway. Because every piece of this mattered now, Ava. I am done asking, come outside, and I felt that cold clarity again, stronger than before, because there it was, the shift from request to expectation to command, the pattern tightening, the tone sharpening, and it confirmed everything I had been piecing together in my head. I locked the screen slowly and set the phone down in front of me, my reflection staring back at me in the glass beyond it, and for the first time, I did not see confusion there. I saw something else, something steadier, something that had been building since the moment I stepped away from that table, because I was no longer trying to return to what I thought was normal. I was trying to understand what had replaced it. I reached for the cash one more time, folding it carefully and slipping it back into my purse. And as I did, one final thought settled into place, quiet but undeniable. Whoever that man was, he had not just interrupted my night. He had given me a chance to step outside something I was never meant to see clearly. And now that I had, there was no going back to the version of this story where I trusted what I was being told instead of what I was beginning to understand. The thought did not leave me after that. It stayed there, quiet and steady, reshaping everything I had believed about the past year of my life, and the more I let it settle, the more details began to surface in ways I could no longer ignore. Small moments that had never felt important before, now lining up with a kind of precision that made my stomach tighten. Mason insisting on helping me reorganize my accounts when we got engaged, saying it would make things easier once we were married. The way he had encouraged me to consolidate everything into fewer platforms, fewer logins, fewer places to check, always framed as efficiency, always presented as something that would help me, and I had trusted that because it made sense, because it felt like partnership. I stared down at my phone again, scrolling further back through my transactions, my emails, looking for anything that stood out not as wrong, but as too clean, too smooth, and that was when I saw it. A series of small transfers over the past few months, nothing large enough to trigger concern, nothing irregular enough to raise suspicion, but consistent, deliberate, moving through accounts in a way that looked like maintenance but felt like preparation. My fingers slowed as I followed the trail, each step leading to another account I recognized, another name tied to something Mason had explained at some point, always casually, always in passing, and now those explanations felt less like information and more like groundwork. My chest tightened as a memory surfaced, something he had said just a few weeks ago, laughing lightly as he showed me a document on his laptop. "It is all about timing," he had said, "moving things at the right moment so no one questions it." And I had smiled, thinking he was talking about business, about strategy, about things I did not need to worry about. Now that sentence landed differently. Heavier, sharper, because tonight had been about timing too. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not look at it right away. I let it sit there on the counter, vibrating softly against the plastic surface. Because I was no longer reacting to him, I was observing him, and that distinction felt important, like a line I needed to hold. I picked it up after a few seconds, glancing at the message without letting it pull me in. "Ava, this is your last chance. Come outside now." And I felt something shift again. Not fear, not even anger, but recognition. Because that was not a message meant to reach me. It was a message meant to control the next step, to force movement, to restore the pattern that had already been broken. I set the phone back down and leaned forward slightly, my eyes moving to the security mirror again, checking the front door, the parking lot, the street beyond, and everything looked the same, quiet, still, unchanged. But I knew better now than to trust what I could see at a glance. I pushed myself up from the chair and walked slowly toward the front window, stopping just short of the glass, keeping my reflection faint and my view clear, and I scanned the area again, more carefully this time, not just looking for him, but looking for anything that did not belong, anything that felt placed instead of natural. A car idled briefly at the edge of the lot before pulling away. A pair of headlights passed on the road without slowing, and for a moment it looked like nothing was there, like the night had settled back into something ordinary. But that did not erase what I already understood. It just meant whatever was happening was adjusting again, shifting around the fact that I was no longer where I was supposed to be. I stepped back from the window and returned to the counter, my movements slower now, more deliberate, as I picked up my purse and slung it over my shoulder, the weight of it grounding me, reminding me that I still had options, that I was not as exposed as I had felt earlier. I looked at my phone one more time, not at his messages, but at the time, at the signal, at the small details that would shape what I did next. And as I stood there under the bright lights, surrounded by the quiet hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of cars passing by, a new thought settled into place, one that felt different from the others, less reactive, more strategic. If Mason had planned this around me, if he had built everything on the assumption that I would follow him, trust him, stay within the structure he created, then the one thing he could not easily account for was me stepping outside of that completely, not just physically, but mentally, not just running, but choosing. I reached into my purse and pulled the cash out again, holding it in my hand for a second longer this time, feeling the texture of the bills, the reality of them, and I realized something I had not fully acknowledged until now. That man had not just warned me, he had given me a way out, immediate, practical, untraceable, something I could use without needing permission, without needing to rely on anyone else. I folded the money back carefully and slipped it into a different pocket, separate from everything else, and as I did, I made a decision that felt both simple and irreversible. I was not going to answer Mason, not now, not until I understood more, not until I was somewhere he could not reach me as easily, because every message, every instruction, every shift in his tone had shown me one thing clearly. He was trying to pull me back into a position where he could control what happened next. And I was done letting that happen. I picked up the bottle of water, more out of habit than necessity, and walked toward the door, my steps steady, my breathing even, and as my hand reached for the handle, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but awareness, because the moment I stepped outside again, I would be re-entering a space I did not fully understand, a space that had already been shaped around me once before. But this time was different. Because I was not stepping back into it blindly, I was stepping into it knowing that something was wrong, knowing that I had already disrupted whatever had been planned, and knowing that from this point forward, every decision I made mattered in a way it never had before. I pushed the door open and stepped back into the night with a different kind of awareness than before, the air cooler now, sharper against my skin, and for a second I just stood there letting my eyes adjust, letting my senses catch up to the decision I had already made inside, because this time I was not reacting, I was moving with intention. The parking lot in front of the store looked the same as it had from inside, quiet, mostly empty, a few scattered cars parked under dim lights, but I did not trust the surface of it anymore. I did not trust anything that looked simple or still, not after everything I had just pieced together. I stepped forward slowly, angling myself away from the main entrance, keeping my movements casual, controlled, like I was just another person heading somewhere without urgency, even though every part of me was alert, scanning, calculating. My phone buzzed again in my purse, the vibration sharp against my side, but I ignored it this time completely, because I understood something now that I had not before. Every message he sent was not just communication, it was pressure, it was timing, it was an attempt to pull me back into a sequence I was no longer following. I moved toward the edge of the lot, choosing a path that kept me in the shadows of the building instead of under the direct light, my steps quiet, my breathing steady, and as I reached the corner, I paused just enough to glance across the street again, checking for the car I had seen earlier, the one that had not felt right. It was gone. That absence should have reassured me, but it did not. It only confirmed what I already suspected. Things were shifting, moving, adjusting around me. I stepped onto the sidewalk again and turned in the opposite direction of the restaurant, continuing along the road with a steady pace, my eyes moving constantly, taking in everything, the parked cars, the passing headlights, the dark spaces between buildings, and for the first time since this started, I felt like I was not just trying to escape something, I was trying to stay ahead of it. My mind moved faster now, connecting the pattern in real time instead of looking back at it, because if everything had been built around expectation, then breaking that expectation was the only advantage I had. I reached into my purse briefly, pulling my phone out just long enough to glance at the latest message without unlocking it. "Ava, do not do this." And I almost smiled at the wording, because that was new. Not a command, not a demand, but something closer to warning, like he was adjusting again, trying a different approach now that the others had not worked. I slipped the phone back and kept walking, my pace unchanged, because whatever tone he used, the goal was the same, to pull me back, to reestablish control, and I was not going to give him that. A car passed me slowly this time, closer than the others had been, and I felt my body tense automatically, my shoulders tightening, my eyes shifting just enough to catch the reflection in the window as it moved by. But it did not stop, did not turn, just continued down the road, and I forced myself to keep moving, to not let every passing moment turn into something bigger than it was. I reached another small intersection, this one more open, a streetlight casting a wider circle of visibility, and I stepped into it deliberately, not hiding this time, not shrinking into shadows, but standing where I could see clearly in every direction, because I realized something important. Staying hidden made sense when I did not understand the pattern, but now that I did, visibility could work in my favor too. Unpredictability was not just about where I went, it was about how I moved. I stood there for a second, longer than necessary, letting my presence exist in that open space, and then I turned again, choosing a direction that led further away from everything familiar, further away from the path Mason would expect me to take if I were trying to return to anything normal. The road stretched out ahead of me, quiet, dim, and as I walked, I felt that clarity deepen, not easing the tension, but sharpening it into something I could use, because I was no longer guessing blindly. I was observing, adjusting, choosing. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not reach for it at all. I let it sit because I did not need to read it to know what it would say. I did not need his words to understand his position, and that separation felt like a shift I could not undo, a line I had crossed without realizing it until now. I passed a row of small beach houses set back from the road, their windows dark, their porches empty, and for a moment I considered knocking on a door, asking for help, stepping into someone else's space, just to break the isolation of this night. But something stopped me. Not fear, but caution, because I did not know how far this extended. I did not know who was involved or what connections existed beyond what I had already seen, and trusting the wrong place now could pull me back into something I had just stepped out of. I kept moving instead, my steps steady, my mind focused, and as I rounded the next bend in the road, I saw something ahead that made me slow slightly. A bus stop shelter with a faint light overhead, empty except for a bench and a posted schedule. And I felt a shift again, small but significant, because that was something structured, something predictable, something not controlled by him. I moved toward it without hesitation, stepping under the light, letting myself be seen in a space that was public, defined, and for the first time since I left that restaurant, I felt something settle inside me that was not just awareness or tension, but direction, because whatever came next, whatever this night was leading toward, I was no longer moving through it as someone being guided. I was moving through it as someone choosing where to stand, and that meant the outcome was no longer entirely his to control. I sat down on the cold metal bench beneath the bus stop light, and for the first time since I walked out of that restaurant, I allowed myself to stop moving completely, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to think clearly about what came next, not just where I was going, but how I was going to turn this from escape into control. The faint hum of the streetlight above me filled the silence, casting a steady glow over the empty road, and I placed my purse beside me, keeping one hand resting lightly on it, grounding myself in something tangible while my thoughts continued to sharpen. My phone buzzed again, more persistent now, the rhythm faster, less controlled, and I knew without looking that Mason was escalating, shifting from calculated to reactive, and that shift mattered, because it meant I was no longer where he needed me to be. I pulled the phone out slowly this time and unlocked it, not to answer, but to read, to observe, to confirm what I already suspected, and the messages stacked one after another. Ava, pick up. Ava, answer me. Ava, where are you? And then finally, I see you are not at the restaurant anymore, and that last message made my chest tighten. Not out of fear, but recognition, because it confirmed something I had been piecing together. He had access to more information than I realized, whether through cameras, people, or something else, and that meant whatever I did next had to assume he could track more than just my phone calls. I locked the screen again and leaned back slightly, my eyes scanning the road, the darkness beyond the reach of the light, and I forced myself to think through this one step further. Not just what had happened, but what he needed from me now. If the plan had been built around timing and positioning, then my disappearance from that sequence was not just a disruption. It was a problem he needed to solve quickly, before whatever he had set in motion reached a point where he could not adjust it anymore. I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cool air, and I reached into my purse again, pulling out the cash, counting it properly this time. $600. Clean, simple, untraceable, enough to move, enough to create distance, enough to buy time, and that word settled into place in my mind again. Time, because that was what this had always been about. Not just his timing, but mine. I slid the money back into my purse and pulled out my phone again, this time opening the settings, my fingers moving with a steadiness that surprised me as I turned off location services, then powered the phone down completely, watching the screen go dark in my hand, and as it did, I felt something shift again, deeper this time, because for the first time since this started, I had removed myself from one of the main ways he could reach me, track me, influence me. I slipped the phone back into my purse and sat there for a second longer, letting that decision settle, letting the silence around me grow heavier but also clearer, because without the constant buzz of his messages, I could hear my own thoughts more distinctly. A car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly illuminating the empty road before disappearing again, and I looked down at the bus schedule posted beside me, scanning the times quickly, noting the next arrival, 12 minutes, and that number felt manageable. Concrete, something I could work with. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on my knees, my eyes still moving, still scanning, but my focus now shifting from reacting to planning, because whatever came next was not just about getting away. It was about understanding how far this went and what I needed to do to make sure I did not step back into it unknowingly. I thought about the accounts again, the transactions, the structure of everything Mason had been involved in over the past year, and a new realization began to form, quieter but just as sharp as the others. This was not just about tonight. Tonight was the execution, the final step in something that had been building for months, maybe longer, and that meant there were records, patterns, traces, things that could be followed if I looked closely enough. I sat up straighter, my mind moving faster now, not in panic, but in purpose. Because if I could step far enough outside of this, if I could create enough distance, then I could start to piece together not just what he had planned, but how he had planned it, and that knowledge could shift everything. I glanced down the road again, checking for any movement, any sign that I had been followed, but the street remained quiet, unchanged. And for the first time, that quiet did not feel like a warning. It felt like space, like an opening I could use. I reached into my purse once more, my fingers brushing against the cash and then the dark screen of my phone. And I realized something that settled into place with a kind of calm certainty. I was no longer the person sitting across from him at that table, trusting his words, following his lead. I was someone else now, someone who had stepped outside the version of events he had constructed, someone who could see the pattern instead of being inside it. The faint sound of an approaching engine reached my ears, and I looked up to see the distant glow of headlights moving toward the bus stop, steady, predictable, exactly where the schedule said it would be, and as the bus drew closer, slowing as it approached, I felt that clarity sharpen into something solid, because this was not just movement, this was direction, a choice that was mine alone. And as I stood up from the bench, my grip tightening slightly on my purse, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Mason had planned for tonight, it was no longer unfolding the way he expected, and from this point forward, every step I took would be one he could not fully anticipate. The bus slowed as it approached, the soft hiss of the brakes cutting through the quiet night, and I stepped forward without hesitation, my hand tightening slightly around the strap of my purse as the doors opened in front of me, because this was not just about getting on a bus, it was about crossing another line, one that put even more distance between me and everything Mason had built around me. I climbed the steps, my voice steady as I asked for a one-way ticket, my fingers pulling cash from my purse instead of reaching for any card he could trace, and the driver barely glanced at me as he handed me a slip, just another passenger in the middle of the night, just another face passing through. I moved down the aisle and chose a seat near the back, close enough to see the door, far enough to watch everything without being obvious. And as the bus pulled away from the curb, I felt something shift again. Not relief, not safety, but separation, physical and immediate, the kind that could not be undone by a message or a call. The road outside blurred slightly as we gained speed, the familiar stretch of coastline fading behind us, replaced by darkness and scattered lights in the distance, and I leaned back in the seat, my eyes still alert, my thoughts moving faster now that I was no longer standing still. I reached into my purse and pulled my phone out again, the screen still dark from when I powered it off, and I held it in my hand for a moment, weighing the decision in a way I had not before, because turning it back on would reconnect me to him, to whatever system he had been using, but it would also give me access to information, to records, to the pieces I needed if I was going to understand what had been happening. I pressed the power button slowly, watching as the screen lit up, the logo appearing before the home screen loaded, and almost immediately, the notifications flooded in, message after message stacking on top of each other, calls, texts, missed attempts to reach me, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not because of the volume, but because of the pattern, the escalation, the shift from controlled to urgent. I did not open them right away. I let them sit there, because this time I was not reacting. I was choosing when and how to engage, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I swiped past the messages and opened my email instead, scrolling quickly through the recent activity, looking for anything that matched the transactions I had seen earlier, anything that connected to the accounts Mason had helped me manage. And as I moved through the list, something caught my attention, a confirmation email from earlier that day, something I had not noticed at the time, because it had arrived while we were still traveling back from our honeymoon. I opened it, my fingers steady despite the tension building in my chest, and read through the details carefully. A transfer authorization, signed electronically, tied to one of the accounts Mason had insisted we set up together, and for a second I did not understand what I was looking at, because the numbers were small, nothing alarming, nothing dramatic, but the timing was precise, processed within a window that aligned almost perfectly with when we had been sitting at dinner. I scrolled further, checking the linked documents, and that was when it clicked, not all at once, but piece by piece, the structure of it, the layering, the way each small action fed into something larger, something that would only become visible when all the parts aligned. My breath slowed as the realization settled in, because this was not just about moving money, it was about creating a sequence, a pattern of activity that would look normal until a specific moment, a moment that had been planned to happen tonight. I leaned back slightly, my eyes lifting from the screen to the dark window beside me, my reflection faintly visible against the passing lights, and for the first time, I allowed the full weight of that thought to settle. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something that had been built around me, using my trust, my access, my name. My phone buzzed again in my hand, and this time I glanced at the screen, not to respond, but to read, because I needed to see how he was adjusting now that I was no longer where he expected me to be. "Ava, listen to me. This is not what you think," the message read, and I felt a sharp, almost hollow shift in my chest, because that line, that exact wording, it was familiar in a way that made everything else feel clearer. It was the kind of sentence someone uses when they are losing control of a narrative, when the version of events they have constructed is no longer holding together the way it should. I locked the screen again and set the phone in my lap, my fingers resting lightly against it, and I stared out at the road ahead, the faint glow of distant lights growing closer as the bus continued its route. And in that moment, something inside me settled into place with a clarity I could not ignore. I was no longer trying to figure out if something was wrong. I knew it was, and that certainty changed everything, because it meant my next steps were not about doubt or hesitation. They were about understanding, about gathering the pieces, about seeing the full shape of what had been hidden from me. I adjusted my position in the seat slightly, my posture more upright now, my focus sharper, because I understood something that I had not fully accepted until now. Whatever Mason had planned, whatever he had set in motion, it was not finished. It was just disrupted, and that meant there were still pieces in place, still connections to follow, still evidence that could reveal how far this went. And as the bus carried me further away from the place where everything had started to unravel, I knew that distance alone was not enough. What mattered now was what I did with it. How I used the space I had created to turn this from something I had escaped into something I could expose. Because the moment I stepped away from that table, the story had changed, and I was no longer just part of it. I was starting to see it for what it really was. It has been 6 months since that night, and my life does not look the way I thought it would, but for the first time in a long time, it feels like it belongs to me again. I wake up in a small apartment in a different city, one with windows that face the morning light instead of the ocean. And while it is quieter, simpler, and far from perfect, it is honest, and that has become more important to me than anything else. The investigation that followed took time, longer than I expected, but piece by piece, everything I had started to see that night came into the light. The accounts, the transfers, the patterns, and the truth was no longer something I had to carry alone. It became something that could not be denied, something that finally held him accountable in a way my silence never could have. I did not go back to the version of my life I had before, because I understand now that it was never as safe or as real as I believed, but I did not lose everything either. I found something I did not even realize I was missing: my own voice, my own judgment, my own sense of where I end and someone else begins. And if there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that boundaries are not something you set after something breaks. They are something you honor before it ever gets the chance, because the moment you ignore that quiet voice inside you, the one that tells you something feels off, you are already giving away more of yourself than you realize. Healing, I have learned, is not about forgetting what happened or pretending it did not matter. It is about choosing yourself anyway, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it changes everything, and especially when it means walking away from something you once believed in. If you are listening to this and something inside you feels familiar, if you have ever doubted your own instincts because someone else made you question them, I want you to know this gently. You are allowed to trust yourself. You are allowed to step away, and you are allowed to choose a life that does not require you to shrink in order to keep it. You are not overreacting. You are not imagining things, and you are not alone in feeling the weight of something you cannot fully explain yet. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for being present in a moment that changed everything for me, because in sharing it, I found a way to make sense of it, and maybe, in some small way, it helps you make sense of something in your own life too. If this story truly resonates with you, I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Because knowing that someone out there hears this and understands makes the world feel a little less heavy. And only if this story speaks to your heart, you can quietly like or subscribe, not because you have to, but because you want to stay connected to stories that remind you of your own strength. My name is Ava Collins. I am 29 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never ignore the moment you feel something is wrong, because that moment might be the one that saves you.